Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Manulife Business Success Series webinar as we learn more about the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund, which helps with liquidity and cash supports to support businesses during COVID-19. My name is Ian McLean, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on the foundation of mutual understanding and respect. Today's session would not be possible without the continued support of our generous sponsors. So a special thank you today to our title sponsor for the Business Success Series, Manulife, and our platinum sponsor of the series, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region. These organizations are committed to supporting our local economy and providing businesses with the resources and tools they need to thrive. I'd like to now welcome Bianca Moldovan, Corporate Social Responsibility Manager with Manulife, to say a few words. Bianca.
Thank you, Ian. On behalf of Manulife, thank you all for joining us here today. We are very proud to sponsor the Business Success Series, bringing together timely support and helping local businesses in our community really navigate through these trying times. We are thankful for the expertise, resources, and knowledge shared through these sessions, like the one that you'll hear from today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ian, to dive into our presenter.
Well, thank you, Bianca. We are thrilled to have Manulife on board with this series and so many other activities that the Chamber puts on as we work to support local businesses during this difficult time. And just before the session starts, I'd like to go over a few quick reminders. Please ensure that your microphone is muted throughout the presentation so we can reduce any background noise. If you have any questions that come up throughout the session, you can type them into the question box in your control panel at any time. If there are tech-related questions, a representative of our team will get back to you in just a few moments. And if their questions are for today's presenter, they'll be gathered throughout the session, and our speaker will do their best to answer as many questions as possible following the presentation. All attendees will be sent a recording of today's presentation that will also be made available on the Greater KW Chamber website. I'd like to now introduce today's guest speaker, Jordan Gresowich. Jordan is a program policy advisor with the FedDev Ontario's program policy team. He has been with the agency since 2011 in various roles in finance, planning, and program delivery. He and his team work to provide program policy analysis and guidance to agency staff and play a leadership role in the development and coordination of FedDev Ontario programming. Please join me in welcoming Jordan. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, and to you, Bianca, as well, and to Manulife for the invitation here today. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and join this session. Thanks to all the members of the KW Chamber of Commerce as well. I have a familiarity. I'm born and raised here in Kitchener, live in Waterloo currently, so I have a great appreciation for the region, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. So. With that said, we're here to discuss the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund in Southern Ontario. So, as it was noted before, this is a new program that was launched by FedDev Ontario back in the spring. It's a combination as part of the Government of Canada's holistic support measure plan to support COVID-19 relief. And we're just going to go over some of the details, the background, eligibility, what the RRRF supports, as we commonly refer to it, and happy to answer any questions at the end. So, with that said, jump in here to the first slide. Just a bit of background about FedDev Ontario. So, as Ian mentioned, I've been with the agency since 2011, and so I have a good familiarity with how we've evolved as an organization. We typically deliver economic development programming across Southern Ontario, working with businesses, not-for-profit organizations, really on technological innovation projects as our traditional kind of work, really trying to support and advance the local economic situations across the various regions of Southern Ontario. So that made FedDev Ontario particularly well placed, along with the other regional development agencies in the federal family, to deliver this quick funding solution or funding opportunity that we call RRRF in the event, in light of the COVID-19 situation. So at FedDev Ontario, on top of being a co-investor, so as I mentioned, supporting these different economic development projects with various stakeholders and businesses, not-for-profits across Southern Ontario, we also work to convene and to join and link up with different organizations to help advance other economic development opportunities. So a particular local example would be working with Communitech, for instance. FedDev Ontario's got a good long relationship with delivering programming and supporting activities of Communitech and other economic not-for-profit organizations across Southern Ontario. So that's another area where we look to join organizations to create pathways and create relationships. So on that note, also being a pathfinder and helping to lead different organization stakeholders that come into FedDev seeking economic support. We might help them pathfind other opportunities to these types of organizations that may offer a more logical pathway to support, as opposed to FedDev Ontario projects, depending on the nature of the outreach that we receive. And we also act as a champion for Southern Ontario, and that's really kind of the holistic summary of these other roles that we look to champion, promote, advance the economic standing, the ability of Southern Ontario organizations, companies to compete, not just within the region or across Canada, but on a global level. So that's just a flavor of what FedDev Ontario offers. And again, so that's where it made sense for FedDev Ontario to be one of the economic engines delivering the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund. So to get into some details about the program itself. So as an overview, the fund was created as a $1.5 billion national fund, as I said, launched back in the spring, so May 2020. With an additional top-up that was launched back just this past month in October. It's delivered by all of Canada's regional development agencies. So we have an agency out west, one out east. Quebec has an agency, there's an agency in the north, and then Northern Ontario is supported by FedNor, which is part of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada organization. So of the share, of the 1.5 billion, FedDev Ontario received $436 million for Southern Ontario, and of that portion, nearly 70 million was dedicated to working with our community futures development corporations that support the community futures regions across Southern Ontario. So I can go into a bit more detail on how that links back to local support here towards the end. But that's just an overview of how the fund was established and just the objectives and approach that was laid out for our agency to deliver this. So the fund itself was intended to be part of a larger approach, obviously. So the Government of Canada's COVID-19 relief plan, seen as a whole, is intended to be that support for businesses, organizations suffering from the impacts of COVID-19. So RRRF is really intended to address gaps and or supplement these other federal relief measures. So we do our best to work in tandem, in concert, and have a relationship and understand the relationship that other federal supports might have with recipients, and we try to obviously create as much of a common support mechanism as we can. So looking at the objectives of RRRF, so RRRF was designed to offer targeted liquidity support for businesses, so small and medium-sized enterprises as we define them, and I'll go into a bit of detail about how that term SME is defined. And it's also intended to support business support organizations whose revenues have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the primary objective is to be a liquidity lifeline for applicants that do not qualify for or have been declined. So those are important terms. So if there has been if an organization's been declined for other measures, that's where we really see RRRF stepping in, be that backstop support. So it also is intended to be a support for applicants who have accessed that type of support but still experience ongoing liquidity pressures. So there are some thresholds and limits in these other government programs. And so if there are still eligible costs that aren't covered by this other programming, that's where RRRF can also play a role to help supplement some of those existing costs that aren't being supported or aren't able to be supported through these other measures. And RRRF is really intended to be that bridge to recovery. So looking at how to help organizations and businesses get through this period by covering fixed operating costs that may not be able to be deferred. So we'll go into some of the examples of those, but typical costs would include insurance, property taxes, I would say utility costs, those kinds of recurring costs that aren't necessarily impacted or revenue dependent. So when revenues or cash flows have been impacted, that's where the RRRF support would step in. And the objective obviously is to help to maintain regular operations as much as possible, so to help keep paying employees and to prepare for a successful recovery. So the RRRF program is targeting, all economic sectors across Southern Ontario. So it's been a bit of an evolution of the design of the program. So those hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic are obviously the ones we are the most focused on, because we really want to help provide that backstop as much as possible to be able to sustain economic activity and sustain businesses during this time. But the significant amount of money has allowed RRRF to be able to be available for businesses and organizations across all sectors. So now priority was initially established to be given to some organizations in the tourism sector and other underrepresented groups. So potentially women entrepreneurs, those in official language minority communities. However, that priority has since been, I would say, broadened to invite as many applicants as possible. So it's not as though there's a triage necessarily happening to prioritize applications as they come in. It's really kind of a first come, first serve. We're handling all cases and all applications as they come to us. So I mentioned on the last slide that the RRRF fund is designed to provide that liquidity assistance. And so to do that, RRRF intends to provide interest-free loans to businesses or not-for-profit organizations that are engaged in commercial activities. And so that's where the operations of an organization are dependent on revenues generated, commercial activities. Those are the types of businesses and organizations that would receive repayable contributions. And so we'll go into the two types of repayable contributions that are offered under RRRF, but those are the targeted organizations that we would see as receiving repayable contributions. And then there's a defined time frame through which that funding would be repaid back to the Government of Canada. Now, non-repayable contributions are intended to be offered for economic or business support organizations that do not engage in commercial activities. So those business or sector associations, chambers of commerce, other engines and organizations that provide, I would say, technical or business support to businesses, but are not directly engaged in commercial activities or commercial in nature. So funding and operational support is received through other means, not through any kind of commercial activity. Now, just as part of our assessment, RRRF loans that are distributed are normally intended to support 6 months of eligible fixed operating costs, and we outline the parameters of the program on our website, and there's a link in the presentation here to the FedDev Ontario RRRF website. But yeah, as part of our assessment, we normally look at supporting up to 6 months of eligible fixed costs. So what we do is we ask applicants to provide a full year's worth of funding. So as I note below there, costs are considered from March 2020 until March 2021. So we do ask applicants to provide us a full year's worth of actual and or projected costs. From there, then as part of our assessment approach, we do tend to look at a 6-month basis and determine the level of support that we would look to offer. Now, obviously, knowing kind of how the delivery and the support is provided, it's important to know who is eligible. So as I referred to earlier, this program is intended to support small and medium-sized enterprises. And what we mean by that is those incorporated businesses and organizations that are engaged in commercial activities with anywhere from 1 to 499 full-time equivalent employees. So anywhere, essentially, any organizations with 500 or any with under 500 employees are eligible for support here. Now, organizations that also provide support services to business, so like as I mentioned earlier, industry or business associations, business accelerators and incubators, they can also apply, and that's where we would be looking at that non-repayable stream. Now, as far as eligibility goes, there is also a requirement that the organization or business would be facing funding pressures with their fixed operating costs due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also, as I said, RRRF is part of the broader federal support approach. So there is a requirement that organizations would have looked at or applied to other COVID-19 relief measures. So we do ask that as part of our application to understand some kind of the interrelationships between the other programs, what funding has been received elsewhere, just so that we can be sure that we're not, I would say, overlapping support and providing more than might be necessary. Now, organizations also need to demonstrate that they were operational prior to March 15. So this isn't for businesses that started after the pandemic took hold, but those that would have felt the impacts of it on their operations. And there's also a requirement that the organization or business will continue to operate or resume their operations, assume that, once the pandemic has concluded. So that's just kind of an overview of the eligibility. We also do understand that we have RRRF recipients that may need additional support. So as I had alluded to earlier, RRRF had a top up back in October, and with that, the parameters of the program did expand. So it's important for organizations to know that if they did receive funding under the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund back during the first wave, May, June, July, that the parameters did expand. So there is the ability to entertain additional costs, provide top-up support. And so the way we have designed this top-up approach is that applicants that have received RRRF funding up until now or previously, they are able to reapply through an abridged application form. So we've designed this on our website through our application form that makes the application process for those that already received RRRF funding, makes it much more streamlined. So it's only a handful of questions as opposed to a full application. So that's important for any organizations and businesses still needing support that feel that they could still benefit from RRRF. It's important that they know that they can reapply through this mechanism. So more detail on eligibility is also provided on the website. So the link is later on in this presentation. And so I encourage those interested to take a look there. Now, in addition to eligibility, we would look at costs that are covered. So I referenced earlier that the fixed operating costs are really what's targeted. And it's really referring to what is non-deferrable. So lease payments, vehicle operations, expenses, office expenses, property tax, utilities, so insurance, bank charges, licensing, salaries and benefits, and rents, only if those costs have not been covered by other measures. So there were some targeted supports established to support salary and benefits and rent. So we do want to consider case by case for every applicant that comes in to understand what type of support has been received through these other mechanisms. So through the wage subsidy, through the rent, the rent subsidy provided through the government of Canada, through other programming. We do need to know what type of support or level of support was received so that we can take that into consideration and not duplicate that type of support. Because as a whole, the government does not want to exceed, let's say, 100% of a cost category. So 100% of salaries and benefits. Obviously, we want to make sure that we have an interrelationship between the funding. Now, what's also important to note here is there may be some one-off costs that are also considered as part of any application. So cleaning and sanitation expenses, one-off stabilization costs to operate during COVID-19, so safety measures, some degree of retrofitting. Now, not necessarily to say new equipment per se, but if there is retrofitting personal protective equipment that needs to be purchased to just maintain existing operations, those are things that are considered on a case-by-case. But they are examples of costs that would be eligible. Now, the alternative to this is what is not covered. So those would be some certain costs that are determined to be variable or somewhat dependent on revenue generation. So examples here include costs deemed unreasonable or unrelated to fixed operating costs. So obviously variable costs and those that vary with production. So inventory, raw materials, contract labor, those that can be deferred are not part of our calculations. Mortgage or loan payments, new capital expenditures or replacement costs. So going back to the previous slide when I mentioned some of the retrofitting, again, this would only cover a very specific type of purchase if it's necessary to maintain operations. Any kind of new equipment purchases would not fall under this program. Refinancing of debt, amortization, acquisition of land and buildings are other examples of what is not covered. So I had spoken about the two types of funding, so repayable and non-repayable. Now we call them contribution agreements. These are what we enter into with successful applicants. So for repayable contributions, we have two types of contributions that we look to enter into. Our first option here is funding anywhere up to $40,000, and these types of agreements are conditionally repayable interest-free loans. And by conditionally repayable, we mean that there is a percentage baked into these types of agreements that can be forgiven depending on whether the bulk of the payment is repaid over a time frame. So as it says here, 25% up to a maximum of $10,000 may be forgiven on the loan, depending on whether the bulk of the payment is made by April 1st, 2023. So as it says here, there's an optional two-year grace period before repayment needs to begin. So no payments are required until that April 1st, 2023. But the recipient is able to make payments anytime before that date. So as it says there, if 75% is not repaid by March 31st, 2023, the balance owing is converted to a 3-year fixed repayment schedule. So the forgivability goes away after that March 31st date, and then the full amount of the contribution must be repaid. Now, option 2 is an unconditionally repayable loan, and it's anywhere up to $1 million. And again, interest-free, but it does not have that forgivability portion. So 100% of the contribution does need to be repaid. There is still that 2-year grace period, so repayment does not need to begin until April 1st, 2023, and the repayment period is established from that date going forward on a monthly basis with set increments each month, and it will vary depending on the size of the loan. Now, what's important to note here under option 1 is that, as I mentioned, RRRF operates in consultation or in in concert with other federal relief mechanisms. So the Canada Emergency Benefit, so CEBA as we call it, also has this forgivability, this forgiveness portion built into the terms of that agreement. So any applicant or any successful recipient under RRRF that also benefited from CEBA would then not be eligible for loan forgiveness under RRRF. So it's important to note that the forgiveness is a one-time thing across programs, across all programs. So the forgiveness would not apply to both CEBA and to RRRF. So I know it's a bit confusing, but there is that need to consider the different elements in play and to make sure that support is equitable across the board. Now, in terms of disbursement related to those two options, so funding under option one, the conditionally repayable, that's delivered in one single advance payment. So once a project once an application is approved, a contribution agreement or contract is established with the recipient, and the funds are dispersed through one single advance payment. Now, under option two, up to $1 million, we do still have an approach where we would advance one single advance payment for any project of $100,000 or less. So if a project is for 80, 90, 95,000, we would still advance that in one single payment. Now, anything greater than 100,000, we would look to advance funds in two increments. So upon the execution of the contribution agreement, so once contracts are signed, we would look to advance 80% of the funding, and then the remaining 20% would be advanced to the recipient once the recipient provides an attestation back. So it's a simple attestation form that's provided back to the agency, verifying that the funding they received already has been spent, and that the organization remains operational and operations are proceeding. So demonstrating that there's still a need for the additional 20%. Now, some other just administrative requirements. When we're delivering RRRF, we do have an expectation of all recipients to provide the agency with a final report, just documentation validating and demonstrating that RRRF funds were utilized for the manner that they were provided, that the full amount was expended for eligible fixed operating costs, and some detail on how the funding helped to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. And as well, we're also interested in having some reporting figures, so knowing the number of jobs that were maintained as a result of the contribution, confirmation that organizations and businesses are continuing to operate, and any other specific metrics to the particular recipient that we may discuss during the contribution agreement development. So just having that follow through on how the funding was received and what the funding resulted in, that just is how we can best demonstrate value for money and know that the funding went to these good causes and was delivered as it was intended. Now, there's also some information that we disclose, that we're required to disclose through legislation for all of our contribution agreements, so not just under RRRF, but under our core programming. Specific details around the recipient name, amount of funding, and a brief description of the funding. So it is standard information that's available either through the Government of Canada's open data platform, or depending on the organization, they may have it directly on their own website. So our information is disclosed through the open data portal. So looking at how we apply, the application form and guide, they're all available on our website. So applicants complete a one-step application, following through the application guide. And we designed it to be as streamlined as possible. And again, depending on the nature of the applicant, if they've received RRRF in the past, the secondary application that's available right now is much more streamlined and only a handful of questions. So the abridged form just really helps to reestablish the relationship that we have with our existing recipients and get the conversation started on how RRRF may be able to support with some top-up funding. The financial information that is provided in the application is used to calculate the funding amounts. So as I said, looking at generally a 6-month window of costs that are supported up to that $1 million threshold. Now, in terms of completeness, we do need to ensure that all mandatory fields are completed in the application and that all supporting attachments are included. So as part of that, one of the primary validation tools we use are financial statements, financial information. So we do need to ensure that some type of documentation related to the financials of the organization are provided. So acceptable types of this include financial statements, either audited or reviewed, or notice to reader statements. So if they're prepared internally, they should include at a minimum a balance sheet and an income statement. So not trying to make it overly difficult, but do need some type of validation of costs to help with our internal assessment. Now, in terms of the application intake itself, we are receiving applications daily. The intake will remain open until the fund is exhausted, so there is no set period to apply. It's really an open process. Applications are assessed as they come through the door, and we're really just trying to keep the doors open as much as we can until we're completely committed in terms of funding. When performing our assessment, we look at a number of factors, the impacts of COVID-19 on the operations, and so that we ideally would look to the state of revenues, state of operations with respect to, I'd say, previous periods or a previous year's financials. The availability of other financial supports, so how the organization or business has accessed other mechanisms like CEBA, like the wage subsidy. Those all come into play in terms of how we determine our level of support. The financial viability of an organization or a business, so the ability of, let's say, a business to repay the contribution. That again is through financial analysis, just to understand what level of support would make sense for a business to take on. And then knowing exactly, or in general, what the RRRF support will be used for by the organization. Those all come into play as part of the assessment process. So moving on, as I referred to earlier, all of this information is available on FedDev Ontario's website, so the link is there. Our program guidelines are laid out to identify eligibility, types of organizations that can apply, the 2 different funding options that I laid out, the partially forgivable and then the non-forgivable. Our application guide is there to help applicants work their way through the application, and then we have some frequently asked questions there to help ideally answer some of the common questions that come through. So now with that concludes my portion, I would say, of this discussion. Happy to entertain questions as they come through. I know I provided a lot of information there, so I'm sure that there is some nuance that may not have been addressed, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information.
So I'm going to just monitor the chat box, but I think I've got a few to get started. So this regional relief recovery fund, I mean, you've highlighted it's really to provide liquidity for businesses who don't qualify for other programs, the original programs. So I guess the question that I would have for this, for anyone listening in, or as people are looking at this as an option, if, as an example, in the first round of programs, your business qualified for as an example, the wage subsidy program, because there are different criteria for each of the programs. So you did qualify for the wage subsidy program, but you didn't either have the ability to get access to the rent program because your landlord did not apply, or for some reason, because there was different criteria in there about revenue drop, that you didn't apply. Can you apply if you, through FedDev for support for that rent portion that you didn't get through the other program? Because that's what this is stacking, is all of the different programs, so you can't double dip on the rent support that you might give versus the other program if you were eligible for it. I think that you were clear on that. But if you were eligible for the wage subsidy but not the rent, can you apply? And the second part of that, is it retroactive? So if I'm discovering the program now because I'm watching the Business Success Series here with the Chamber, can I apply for a previous period?
So I'll answer those in sequence. So to answer the first question, if you did receive support under one of the other federal measures, yes, you are still able to apply. And that really is, I would say, the ideal scenario. Ideal is probably not the best word, but that really is the intent of RRRF, is to know the landscape of funding that an organization or business did receive, so that then we can help to fill in the gaps for anything that was not received or not covered. So as you said, we want to make sure we're not doing any of that double dipping. We're not overlapping support. We're not funding any category beyond 100%. So knowing, the landscape of the other types of funding that were received is important, so that we can make sure that we're providing the appropriate level of support. So that said, as part of the application, we do still want all costs to be documented, along with this information on other supports received. So if a business received the wage subsidy, we wouldn't want them to take wages off the table in terms of their fixed operating. We do still want to know the impact, or the salary amount that would apply to the period. We would just then do our internal arithmetic to make sure that we're only covering a portion. We're looking at supporting a portion that wasn't already previously covered. And to answer your second portion on, sorry, Ian, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, just on the second point about retroactive, yes, this is retroactive. So as I had said earlier, we are looking at costs from March 15th, 2020, all the way through to March 31st, 2021. So if someone's applying today, a business is looking for support today, we do want to base our support on costs dating all the way back to the start of the pandemic, so that March 15th date. And all funds, or all expenses, fixed operating during that time period, would be considered as part of our level of support calculation.
And that's why we've been trying to share this, and we're happy that you've come on today, because many businesses, for a variety of reasons, may have been program design, or their landlord didn't apply. The rent program was the one where there was a lot of people that didn't get that support, even though it was designed to get it. So this is good to know that for those, they can make that application, do it retroactively, and maybe get some of that cash flow support on the rent portion that they haven't gotten yet. So here, the next question, as I'm still monitoring, I'm getting a few comments like this, and I would say there's a big difference between small and medium-sized business. So as an example, many of our members in the chamber, probably 75% of them would have 20 employees or less, and most of them with 10 employees or less. But you've got a big range of 500 employees or less that are eligible for this program. How do you work with the smallest of the small, right? That are really, maybe it's me running my own business with 2 or 3 part-time folks, and it gets really complicated when you get into making these applications. It seems like it's online and it's not all that complicated, but if someone is running into problems, how do they connect with you? Is there a number to call? Are you willing to work with those small businesses to help them navigate, to make sure you you've got what you need to be able to make a decision on their application.
Yes, absolutely. So we do have our call center actually set up. So Small Business Services is a call center internally established. They've been in place dating long before the pandemic hit, but they are our kind of internal triage team that fields questions, works with potential applicants, those seeking additional information on the program, because the types of businesses you just laid out there are those that we are intimately interested in supporting and making sure that we are getting the funding out to those that need it the most. So anywhere from that one employee organization all the way up to 499 are encouraged to apply, and we do look to connect in with them as necessary. So our call center is in place to field questions and to put folks in touch with our team, depending on the nature of the questions. So our small business center is able to field a number of questions and help with some of that troubleshooting, but they do also refer questions back to us and play that intermediary role to help make sure that we're getting answers out to folks that are facing difficulties or do have questions around how to apply.
Well, that's good to know, is that there's someone at the other end of the phone. So you got a call center number. You're going to tell us at the end of the thing what that is. We'll reinforce that when we send out this recording and post it. There also is a website. I guess the follow-on question, I think I heard it, but I want to make sure, is the submitting of the application, is it all available to do online, or do you have to complete it and mail it in? I mean, I think you said it was online, but most of the information the information that you require can be submitted online. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's all intended to be web-based. So it's all writable PDF form that populates radio buttons. It allows for attachments. So yes, it can all be done online and submitted that way. That is the most efficient way to get an application in same day.
Okay, and just to follow this along, again, you've got the 1-800 number, you've got the website, and probably a Q&A option. But if you submit or if I submit my application as a small business and something's missing, does it automatically get tossed out, or does one of your colleagues say, "Hey, look, we need this piece of information before we can process"? Like, it wouldn't be the first time that in business or in government, if you didn't have it all right, it's not approved and you have to start all over again? Or is this an iterative process of saying, hey, here's what we do need so that we can appropriately decide your case and support you financially?
No, that's a great question. So with the urgency of the situation and the urgency to get funding out, yes, there is kind of that active outreach and engagement from our staff, from our team, back with applicants that may still be missing some information. So it's somewhat different than how we've done other programming, in that there is that expectation that a fulsome application is provided, and it's, I'd say, more on a voluntary basis if you're looking for government support under our core programming. However, that we recognize the situation now. So the application itself, there are stages and stage gates in there that won't allow the application to be submitted. So if some mandatory fields aren't completed, it won't be able to be submitted. Now, when it comes to attachments, it can't be that smart or that learned. So if there are some additional attachments that would be of benefit to help with the assessment, that's where some engagement would take place to funnel back information, or just communicate back with applicants and encourage either a resubmission or seek out some additional information.
Okay, and this is where it gets complicated for businesses, but you're doing a great job of trying to highlight how this fits together with.
I'm trying.
Yeah, no, it's going. I'm understanding it. If I can understand it, I suspect most people can. But as an example, there's the original, I'll call it the original rent program. program. Now there's a new rent program.
Yep.
If you didn't got access to the first and not the second, you can apply for at least to see whether you're eligible through this program with FedDev, or vice versa. You got it, didn't get it the first time, you got it the second time. You're saying there could be an element, even if you're accepting of the rent program, the new rent program, there might be a portion that wasn't covered under that program. You wouldn't be able to double dip, but there could be some eligible expenses in this program versus the other. So I guess the purpose of the question is, a business should be making these applications to make sure that they're getting the maximum amount of support that the government wants them to have. By at least putting the application in saying, I'm getting rent, because you're admitting you're getting the rent support program from the new program, but you want to make sure that you're not leaving anything on the table, because it's all cash flow support for that business. Is that how you would see making sure you apply for all the opportunities that are there?
Yeah, I would characterize it just as you did, that you want to cast as wide a net as possible, and try to work with as many organizations and programs as you possibly can to tap into that available support. Now, where RRRF differs slightly is that repayability factor. So that's where we have a bit of a backstop, that ours isn't just a subsidy. That's where we end up being that, I would say, secondary option. Obviously, if a business is able to go get funding through the rent subsidy, they're obviously going to choose that option prior to coming to FedDev. But like I had said earlier, we were interested in not just supporting those that were declined for other programs, but for supplementing those other programs that aren't covering at a full 100%, obviously, and may not cover all time periods throughout the year. So yeah, we are that additional supplement on top of other programs when necessary. So depending on the nature of the application and the type of funding that can be received, because those other programs you mentioned supported at a discounted rate, so it wasn't 100%. So we might look at sorry, go. Yep.
No, I think that's important information. I'm not sure I really understood that connection between I was under the impression that if you didn't get it in the other programs, that this was a program to support that. So it is important for people to understand that they might have some additional ability to get some cash flow support, even if they've got it from another source, which is great information. Listen, I want.
Well, especially because. Sorry, just to add to that, because the nature of those other programs are that they're not running the full year, and so that's where we have the advantage that we are considering costs for an entire year. So the rent subsidy, for instance, is looking at month by month, and they're only dating back to September. So let's say that a business didn't get rent support under the SECRA because their landlord didn't pursue it. So rent that was incurred back in June that would not be eligible under the new rent subsidy and wasn't covered through the other mechanisms, that would be something that we would take into our calculation. So that's where it is it's going to be case by case, just depending on the nature of each individual applicant's situation. But that's just an example of how we are looking to consider different costs, to obviously not have that double dipping, but to still get money in the hands of those that need it.
I just seen a question here. I'm going to give you the opportunity at my last question, which is to tell us the phone number of the call center, the website information, so people can see that. But there is someone's, Chris, I think, was on the site and saying there's no submit application button that he could see right now. Now is that likely because you have to have all those fields filled in before you'll be able to go to that to finally submit your application?
Yes, the submit application should populate once the mandatory fields have been populated.
Okay. Now, last question, and we do have rural communities that surround Waterloo region. So the portion of this fund that I think you said, or looked at like 70 million for rural communities, is that for businesses or in rural communities, or is that for smaller villages or towns? Is that specific for lower tier municipalities, as an example? What's that specifically for? And if it is for business, what types of businesses would qualify for that?
Sure. No, that's intended to be support for, let's say, call them Main Street businesses. So a lot of those very small, including sole proprietorships, businesses in those rural communities that are served and supported by the Community Futures Development Corporations, those are really the targeted organizations and businesses that fund would support. So yeah, a lot of that frontline Main Street business,
retail and sole proprietors, retail. Okay, but so if you're a business in Elmira or St. Jacobs or New Hamburg or Linwood, surrounding the region, this is an option for people to be, again, saying, at least look at what that portion of the program is and how you might fit into that. But that's specifically for businesses that are located in what you would be considered rural communities across southwestern Ontario.
Yes, and they would be encouraged to work directly with their Community Future Development Corporation. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. I'm lobbing up a big softball for you here. If someone wanted to apply, tell us about the website and the call center, because I think that call center in particular, if you get a little frustrated, and I can get a little frustrated with online technology because I'm not very good at it, but there is ways that you and your colleagues will help make sure we can get that.
Yes, for sure. So I'm actually noticing that the link here. So we're going to provide this presentation after the fact. We'll make sure that this is in the hands of folks. I'm looking at our website, or this last slide here, that should actually have 2 D's in it, Fed Dev Ontario. So apologies to those on the call, but that is our website with the details on the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund. As well, just on our homepage, Fed Dev Ontario, we do have a contact us button there that directs you to the 1-800 number. I'm just going to grab it. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it is right at the bottom of our website, and we'll make sure that we provide that to folks on the call as well in our follow-up.
Great.
But here, I'm just pulling it up to make sure that I'm not missing it.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure that we put out that information when we pass out the presentation, and as we're promoting this online as well, make sure that we've got the right website as well as the phone number, because that'll be important information. Listen, thanks for joining us today, Jordan. That does bring us to the end of today's session. Thank you once again to our title sponsor of the series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor of the series, Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and to today's speaker, Jordan Gresowicz. And finally, to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, we host a new Business Success Series session every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Next week, join us as we chat with a local success story, Amber French, and she is the CEO of Supply and Protect. She started this business, and it's really to make sure that small and medium-sized businesses can have access to all the PPE that they require to safely operate their business during this pandemic. It's a tremendous local success story, and one that helps many businesses in making sure they have the PPE they need. So for full details and to register, visit greaterkwchamber.com. And please share this series with your friends and colleagues. We want to have more people. It's free, obviously, and want to make it available to any business in the region of Waterloo to help them navigate through COVID. So join us every Wednesday afternoon for another edition of the Greater KW Chamber of Commerce Business Success Series, brought to you by Manulife and Immigration Partnership Waterloo Region. Because if it's Wednesday, it's the Business Success Series. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon. Thanks, Jordan. That was awesome.
Thanks to everybody for the opportunity.